All right, I think we're ready to get started. So tonight's webinar is Formative Assessment Strategy, Thinking Beyond the Paper Pencil Test. And tonight we'll be talking primarily about ELA assessment, but there are a lot of equivalents and parallels that you can take and apply to mathematics. So if you are a mathematics instructor, just be aware that most of the examples tonight will be about ELA, but there's certainly content that you can apply to your own work. I am your host for this evening. My name is Claire Rivero. I am the Digital Strategy Manager at Student Achievement Partners. My co-host for this evening is Laura Hansen. She is on the Tools and Classroom Resources team along with me, and she is the Senior ELA Literacy Specialist here at Student Achievement Partners. So you'll be hearing a little bit from Laura throughout the presentation, but primarily you'll be hearing from our two guest presenters, Dr. Brian Dross and Arthur Everett, who have extensive experience with formative assessment and will have a lot of great wisdom and practical advice to share with you. So tonight's webinar is part of our Core Advocate webinar series, and everyone here is welcome tonight, whether or not you are a Core Advocate. But if you haven't formally joined the network, we do invite you to do so. The link is here on this slide. It is also in your resources widget. And there's a lot of great benefits to being a member of this free network. And if you have questions about what it means to be a Core Advocate, you can reach out directly to Jenny Beltramini. Her email address is here. And we invite you to take a survey that tells us a little bit more about you and your work and what you're interested in. And that will add you to our mailing list, and you'll get a lot of great communications about professional learning opportunities like this. You'll also get our new magazine, which is just for Core Advocates and launched just last month. It's pictured here. And then lastly, we invite you to visit our website, achievethecore.org. There's tons of free resources, including many for assessment and some that will be mentioned tonight. If you're active on Twitter, we would love for you to share what you're learning with your virtual PLC on Twitter. And you can do that using hashtag #CoreAdvocates. You can also reach out to us directly on Twitter. Student Achievement Partners is at AchieveTheCore on Twitter. So if you want to reach out to us, you can use that handle. And Brian and Arthur are also on Twitter, and you can see their handles here. I'd also like to point out that there is a Twitter button in your toolbar, so if you don't want to have multiple tabs open and you want to make sure you're totally involved in the webinar, but you also want to tweet from time to time, you can use that Twitter button that is on your screen. And lastly, we really want you to engage with us on this webinar. So during the webinar, there are a couple of ways that you can engage with the content, with the presenters, with each other. One is to ask questions of the presenters, and that is that purple Q&A button that's in your toolbar. And you can ask questions at any time during the webinar. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. But if you have a burning question, you don't want to forget it, you can go ahead and ask that at any time. And then the group chat widget, which is the blue button with the little speech bubbles. I see many of you, thank you, have already been introducing yourselves and making use of the group chat, and we'll be using that throughout the presentation to have some group discussion. And then lastly, there's the resources tab, and we'll be sharing a number of free resources and links, and those can all be found in the resources widget. So after the webinar, we will be sending a recording, and it will be emailed to you at the address with which you registered. And then in 2 weeks, you will receive another email with a short survey that primarily is asking about whether you've been able to use any of the information or resources that were shared on tonight's webinar. And after you complete that survey, you will receive a certificate with 1 professional learning credit hour. So the goals for tonight's webinar. We're going to learn about the features of strong formative assessments and the process as it applies mainly to ELA. We want to understand that formative assessment is an ongoing process, and it's much more than formal assessment with which you may be more familiar. We want to identify the different types of data and feedback you'll get from a multifaceted formative assessment process, again, primarily in ELA. And we're going to discuss the use of formative assessment data to design effective ELA instruction and enhance equity in the classroom. So the first question that I'm going to ask, and that we're going to discuss as a group, is what words come to mind when you hear the word assessment? And this can be any kind of assessment. So I'd love for everyone to find that little blue group chat widget and just do a couple of words that come to mind, gut reaction when you hear the word assessment. Oh, I see a great one, checking for understanding. A lot of people responding with the gut reaction of test, a lot about collecting information. Brian, I'm going to toss it over to you for the next section, and maybe you want to talk a little bit more about some of the great responses that we see coming in fast and furious on the group chat here.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. There's lots of great responses coming in there. I love the one that just came in that said driver of lesson plan. That's awesome. We've got some more traditional responses like testing and quizzing and things like that. And so with that, we're definitely going to go and hopefully expand our definition as we go into these sections tonight. So we're going to start with our next section, or I should say our first section, on what is formative assessment and what role does it play in kind of a larger assessment system that we're talking about as we go on. So in this particular case, as we start to look at these pieces and parts, I want to remind people that the word assessment comes from the word assidere. It's a Latin word, and it's one of my absolute favorite definitions as kind of an educator, and it means to sit beside the learner. I mean, I think in kind of our culture and society right now, we've done a lot of sitting across from the learner. We've done a lot of sitting, from high on with learner when it comes to testing and things of that nature. But what's really great about the formative piece is we really get to get down into the nit and gritty and actually work with kids. And with this piece and part to the puzzle, we're really talking about collecting information. This really isn't about putting a grade on things when this is all said and done, as we're talking about formative. So as I like to think about this, any type of assessment kind of goes ahead and exists on a continuum. We really have kind of three types. We've got diagnostic assessments, we've got formatives, and then we have summatives. And those kind of basically exist to kind of help us organize what we're doing with the information as we're classroom teachers or even administrators and things of that nature. I think it's important that we contextualize it in those three areas because it starts to affect what we can do with various types of information as we go forward. So we're actually going to dive into our formative assessment definition because that's really where we're going to spend our time today. But we just wanted to make sure that you're aware that those different types do exist. So as we're talking about formative assessment, we're relying on this definition this evening that it refers to a collaborative process between teachers and students where we're basically looking at students' learning and their conceptual organization so that we can identify strengths, diagnose some weaknesses, identify areas of improvement, figure out strengths that students have so that teachers can make instructional planning decisions and students can actually use that information to adjust their learning. And I think that's a really, really important piece to the puzzle when we're talking about formative assessment is that students have a role in this as well too. As I've been working with teachers over the last years, the one thing I hear all the time is, Brian, I seem to be doing more work and my students are doing less. And my answer to that always is, how effective are we with our formative assessments? That will give them the opportunity to get into that. So the question then becomes is, well, how do we know that something is formative when it's all said and done? So when I think about formative assessment, I kind of think about these characteristics. It requires students to engage with feedback. It's really important that there's some type of feedback that comes so that they can make that adjustment that I just talked about. It has a clear, specific learning goal. It's really true in any assessment, and that there's some defining piece that we're actually looking. We can't just cut off students' heads, look inside, and say this is what they know. Instead, we're making an inference. And in order to do that so that we can make the instructional adjustment and students can make their adjustments, we have to really think about that specific learning goal. It's really helpful if that feedback that we give them in relationship to the learning goal is non-evaluative. It needs to relate to the learning goal, but it needs to be in the process of learning. We shouldn't feel bad when this is all said and done, that we're in the process of learning, we're making adjustments. It also, of course, goes ahead and requires the instructional adjustment for the teacher. And I think that's truly one of the hallmarks of what makes something formative, is that I'm making a change based on what students are providing me, based on my check for understanding. I'm now adjusting what I'm doing in the classroom, as well as how students are making adjustments as well, too. So in pure summary, when we kind of look at the slide that's up there in front of you, you'll see that there's really those three components. There's the feedback piece, there's the timing piece, and then there's the student involvement piece. And so with that, you know an assessment is formative if it's providing evidence of student learning in relationship to the learning goal, such that you as an educator can make an instructional adjustment of some sort. We know that there's a timing component in the fact that it's got to be within the learning cycle. We have to make an adjustment with either in the same lesson, perhaps in the same week, maybe in the same unit. And then from there, it has to give that student feedback process when it's all said and done. So two colleagues and mine, we designed a few years back this graphic that you see on your screen now that talks about what the classroom assessment cycle looks like. And as I mentioned a little earlier on, there's two parts or two people that exist in this process. There's a teacher and there's a student. So as you're looking at the graph, you'll see that there's kind of two colors there. The lighter blue represents student actions in the formative assessment cycle or the classroom assessment cycle, and the darker blue represents what happens with the teacher in this case. You can actually start at any part on the cycle, but generally people start kind of at 12 o'clock if you're looking at it as a clock. And at that point in time, the teacher and student together, we identify and work on possible learning targets. And sometimes when I work with teachers, they say to me, well, why do students get to identify the possible learning targets? Well, if I take that from a student who's maybe gifted or accelerated, they may be able to identify some of their learning needs perhaps more so than we can as the classroom teacher. It's their job to help us figure those out, and it's our job as the educator to actually set that learning target. Then from there, it's the student's responsibility to actively engage in the instruction that the teacher is going to provide. From there, we're going to go ahead and start to use evidence that we're collecting. We might go ahead and do an exit flow. We might go ahead and do a Kahoot. We might go ahead and ask detailed questions of students to figure out what it is that they know. This is where the point where a decision has to start to be made. And what essentially happens is the teacher might have to adjust the instruction because, you know what, they just didn't get it the way I presented it. Or perhaps it's a possibility that the teacher or that the student has to revise their thinking and or responses because the teacher did a really good job on this. I'm just missing something, and that's where my feedback comes in. But let's say what happens is that the students all got it. Well, this gives us the opportunity from the student perspective to solidify their learning, and then from there, the teacher can go ahead and continue on the cycle again to reinforce that, and then to continue on the cycle again and introduce a new learning target in cooperation with the students. So when this is all said and done, we also have in that relationship to that cycle is that collection of evidence piece. So in looking at the next slide, this is a graphic that comes from two researchers by the name of Brent DeCore and Carrie Holmberg, and they wrote a book about formative assessment and the pieces and parts. And so in that decision piece that's happening around the cycle, they conceptualize is that teachers have to think about this formative process in terms of moves. And you'll see that they kind of have this color-coded graphic here. And they kind of highlight areas of actions that teachers take. Like they might tag, they might bounce, they might probe, they pause, pose, prime, and of course, bin when this is all said and done. So if I kind of think about what we did here this evening in the webinar with that introductory question that we had, we actually went through, I as the instructor, for lack of a better term, as one of the presenters in the webinar, I thought about all of those types of things. We asked that question. There's going to be some follow-up here in a minute. We sampled a variety of responses. From there, we paused. Claire was very intentional in her statement. She gave people a lot of time to think about that. That allowed me to start to collect information and adjust some of the comments that I was going to make. This diagram is really kind of important in the fact that you can do this in any direction. You don't have to start with tagging. You don't have to start with priming. You can go through all of those things. And it really helps to make student thinking visible when it's also done by collecting these things, which we know is one of those pieces and parts that's really important for feedback. That brings us up to another poll. As I just got done saying, feedback is really, really important in this process so students can address their thinking. So the question becomes that we'll throw out to you guys in the poll here is, what strategies do you use to provide actionable feedback to students? So if you'll take a minute and share those out in the chat box there, that would be awesome.
Yep, and again, to share your thoughts and join the discussion, you can use the blue group chat button. That's the blue button in your toolbar that has the two little speech bubbles. So just thinking about the question, what strategies do you use to provide actionable feedback to your students?
We're getting lots of great responses in there. I'm particularly partial to some of the digital technology tools that people are using, things like Padlet, things like electronic conferencing, and we'll talk more about some of those strategies later on this evening. Exit tickets are popping up. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was gonna, yeah, there's so many great responses. I could spend the rest of the webinar reading out these wonderful responses. But we're gonna keep moving. I'm gonna toss it over to Arthur. Arthur, do you wanna get going?
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm trying to read all these responses. They're coming in so fast. So hi, everybody. My name's Arthur, and thank you for the responses. Keep them coming in. I've seen some great things like Padlet and data chats and conferencing and exit slips, Google Classroom. So we're going to talk a little bit here just about the formative assessment process. And so the big takeaway, and you've heard this before, that assessment is a process. It's not a one and done. And so often, like, you know, the whole idea of assessment being attached to a grade is what we're trying to blow up here, because formative assessment really is about assessing student understanding and being able to make those adjustments in the moment. So the things that we're looking for are, where am I going, where am I now, and what am I going to do next? The achievement gains associated with formative assessment have been described as among the largest ever reported for educational interventions. That's according to a study from the Center of Educational Research and Innovation. And the whole idea is that schools that use formative assessment accurately not only show general gains in academic improvement, but they also show particularly high gains for previously underachieving students. And just coming from New York, which is a really huge district, 1.1 million students, I know that a lot of our students are not where they're supposed to be academically, and like formative assessment is a way to help reach students where they are and then give you the tools to be able to support them to getting them where they should be. So just some key takeaways about formative assessment. Again, it's a process, and I love this graphic here because it kind of gives you a breakdown of just all of the different types of assessment, right? Summative, interim, and then formative. It's a part of instruction, and it provides real-time information for teachers to be able to adjust their instruction. It also provides students with actionable feedback in the moment or relatively close to the instructional moment, because studies show that if you get the feedback at that time, then you can make the adjustments, and it's not something that happens outside of the learning. It becomes a part of the learning process. So formative assessment practices can take many forms, and it could be as simple as questions posed from the teacher to the class to just see about comprehension, or it can be as simple as observing the things that are happening in the room to see whether or not students are talking about the activities or the questions that come up for students or misconceptions. Are they on target? And then that gives the teacher information to be able to direct the lesson. Some examples of formative assessment, and I've broken them up here. We think about, in general, the buckets of reading and writing, and then listening and speaking. So some of the reading and writing formative assessments include annotations and class notes or thought catchers, the places where you're asking students in the lesson to answer questions, take notes, record their thinking in terms of if they're reading something, they may be annotating for words that they don't know. They may be asking questions of the text of the author. More directly, you may have comprehension questions that they're answering, text-dependent or text-specific questions, to assess whether or not students' comprehension is accurate, because that can give you information. If all the students didn't answer question 5 well, then you know that you might have to dig deeper into that content or whatever that skill was that question 5 was addressing. Quick writes and summaries are great ways to encourage students to elaborate on their thinking, and these are things that can be, you can read over the shoulder, you can collect really quickly, and then get a sense of where the students are. Same thing with exit slips and questionnaires. Also, in terms of formative assessment, I love procedural checklists. We want students to be moving towards independence, and so giving them opportunities to check off where they are in terms of the metacognition of their own understanding is helpful to you as a teacher to see where they are, but also helpful for them to be able to identify places where they struggle, where they've fallen down, or where they've excelled. In terms of the listening and speaking assessments, I love the nonverbal communication hand signals. I know that especially at the beginning of a unit or the beginning of a skill, there's a lot of teacher talk, right? And so, after 3 or 5 minutes of teacher talk, I want to make sure that kids understand. And when you say, are there any questions? Of course, kids are like, no, I don't have a question. But if you ask, thumbs up, thumbs down, did you understand? Did you get that point? Did you not get that point? Did you need clarification? That opens up an opportunity for students to say and for you to see visually where students are, because you might need to do remediation. You might think that you planned it perfectly and what you said made sense, but then you realize, oh, it went over what everybody said. Similarly, restating. Sometimes when I give directions and I say, does everybody have it? I cold call a person, or I say, can somebody restate what those directions are? And then you can listen back to hear, oh, okay, so you did hear that, and that was accurate, or there's some confusion here, and now I need to correct. Discussion protocols for when students are working together and they're discussing, giving them the tools to be able to have the kind of academic discussions that we want students to be able to have is a good check, because you can then, as you're listening, right, am I hearing the type of conversation that we're supposed to be having? Do I need to reteach something? Do I need to focus on a group? Or I might hear something in a conversation that a group is having that I want to bring to the rest of the class. So that's also like about accountable talk in small groups. Once you've given them the protocol and you're listening for those targets, that gives you the opportunity to say, oh, this group came up with a really interesting thing. I want to bring it to the rest of the class. Did anybody else come up with that? And then finally, same thing with questions, comprehension and text-dependent questions. Also listening for them to be answered in discussion, just like in writing, is another comprehension check.
And Arthur, this is Laura. Just to say it, some of these strategies that you just described, even though they're, many of the examples are specific to ELA, I know there are math teachers on the phone, and
yes.
Many of these would apply to math as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing that point up. I mean, I agree, and in terms of explaining your thinking, or why is the problem right or wrong, or what step of the problem did you have an issue? Absolutely, that's thank you so much for bringing that up. And I also just went back in case anybody wanted to see those again. So we've also got some digital tools for you here, and these are only 3. There are myriad of them out there, but Padlet allows you to make comments and embed photos and videos, and we've given you a link there. You can place some information, and students can respond, and that gives you the opportunity as a teacher to kind of get a sense of where the class is. Today's Meet also is another one that allows you to back channel during discussion. So even today, like while we're having this discussion, the group chat, right, is happening. And so using a tool like Today's Meet allows students who, especially those who may be shy in talking, or there's not enough time to get to every student, you can still have an ongoing online discussion that is giving you purposeful information that you can act upon. Recap is also another tool. It's a video-based, and it allows you to pose a question and then have students respond via video, which my students love that. Like the ability to be able to point the camera at themselves and give some type of video response on the cell phone and use that as feedback, and then for you to be able to then view that video and then respond to that student either online or in person, like, oh, I saw your video and you asked this question, I wanted to get back to that. So you have those links there, and I hope that those are great tools for you to use. And certainly in the group chat, if anyone has any other digital tools that they use that they want to share, please share them with us. Okay. And so the basic point here, I love this little character. That's like who I would be in another life, is that formative assessment empowers you as an educator to be the diagnostician who is really assessing student need in your class in the moment, and then being able to decide grouping, remediation, what needs to be retaught, which students need to be pushed further. And I'm going to turn this over now to Brian.
Thanks, Arthur, for go ahead and handing that over. I did want to make one comment based on the previous slide, and this just happens to be the world we live in 2019 with technology. That website, Today's Meet, unfortunately was merged about 2 weeks ago, so now it's a new site. It's called Back Channel Chat, and that's the one I'm going to take us into in the next slide here. So for those of you who are asking that question, you're going to, hey, that website's been shut down. That is true. It did recently go down, and it's now been replaced with a better tool that's called Back Channel Chat. It still has the same functionality as Today's Meet. It's just configured a little bit different. And so with that, basically, as Arthur started to mention, back channeling is a really great opportunity to get us into some of those listening and speaking standards, or even listening and writing standards as students are working with different things. And so kind of like what we're doing in this webinar now, what you see on your screen, that's kind of the front channel. So in your classroom, that might be you at the front of the classroom, that might be playing a video clip, an audio clip, something of that nature. And what's going on in the back is the conversations that we're going ahead and having via the discussion board right there. Works the exact same way in the classroom, that you get to go ahead and have students interact that way. For those of you that are concerned about privacy or about kids doing inappropriate things, you can moderate those comments and do different things like that as well too, to make sure that they're there. What's great about it is that from the formative perspective, you can actually enter into some of those moves. You can tag student responses. You can bounce and get a wide range of information that's going on in the classroom. It gives you the opportunity to pause, and then of course you can collect that information and bin it as we go through. And so that's just one tool I've been experimenting with so far. The other tool that I want to share with you is from a website called Flippity. And you'll see on the screen there, these are some of my third graders grappling with some complex text last year. When I was working with my third grade team, what I found very quickly from them was, you know, Brian, we love the SAP mini assessments online. Everybody loves those. Great, but they go, sometimes the kids find them a little boring. It's like taking another test, but we still really need that information. So we went ahead in my district and we inverted this. We took the same text, the fisherman and his wife, and we built it into an electronic escape room. And it's basically a template on flippity.net, and you kind of type in your questions. And so from there, you can kind of see all the kids' responses that they had. They go, we loved it. It was challenging. My brain hurts, but I still learned, all these fun things coming out of third graders' mouths. But what we found from the teacher perspective, or even from our central office perspective, is that we had some really actionable things that we could do with those pieces and parts that were going on. So those are just two kind of examples of digital tools that were there. So we're going to kind of enter into our next section, which is about designing these formative assessments. How do you use those digital tools in a way that will help you gather some meaningful information? And so on our slide in front of you, you'll see that I have this image. It's an infamous image in our area. It's called the evidence-centered design in the classroom. And the first time I saw it was almost 6 years ago to the day. I know exactly where I was sitting. I remember the day exactly. It happened to be my birthday, which is next week. So we're almost quite to that point in time for the first time I saw it. And what it reminded me of is that when we're working with assessments, when we're working with anything really, we really have to think about what it is that we're trying to prove about student learning. Same thing in a summative assessment, in an interim, as well as in a formative assessment. We really have to think about what it is that we want students to know and be able to do. In our world, that's really simple. It's the standards. That's what we're asking of teachers to teach. That's what we want students to come away with and knowing. And so with that, we start to go ahead and make an inference. And we design that based on what is called a claim. In my psychometrician world, that's the technical term, the claim. What is it that we want to claim about students? And then from there, we go ahead and design our classroom assessments or classroom activities to go ahead and elicit those evidence pieces. In this chart, a formative could be at any one of those spots. It could be the actual activity we're doing in the classroom that day. It might be more of a formal one that we might administer, or it might be a larger and interim one as it's going through that process. In order to get to those claims, we have to really think about the 3 shifts in ELA. And so as just a reminder to our audience, you have to think about the fact that we've got our complex text that's there. We're talking about regular practice with complex text, and it's academic language. I always like to go ahead and emphasize that word "and" because we need both. We have to go ahead and provide evidence from the text, reading, writing, speaking, and listening grounded in that. And then, of course, we're going to build knowledge through the content-rich nonfiction that we're all familiar with. And so with that, we've gone ahead and we've taken those shifts and we've started to apply them to assessment in kind of the design factor, whether it's formative or summative. So if we're looking at the first shift and we're talking about traditional assessment and we're talking about complex text and its language, we used to do little emphasis on text complexity, and now we're moving to strong emphasis on text complexity. That's the same thing for formative. If we're trying to check on standards, we have to check where the standards ask us to check. So as a result, we want to make sure that we've got large, or not necessarily large passages, but passages that have large emphases on text complexity. We're going ahead and we're targeting those Tier 2 academic vocabulary words because we know those are the words that are central to the idea of the passage. They help kids make sense of the passage. And then from there, we're going ahead and we're not focusing on figurative language questions that require an analysis of the literary terms. We're focusing on the meaning of those things. I like to use this example all the time when I'm working with teachers. I happen to have in my hand right now a pen. And in my hand, I'm thinking my pen is like a sword. My pen is like a sword. And for all you English teachers out there right now, you heard is, and probably some of you thought to yourself, ooh, simile. That's the question he's going to ask. That's kind of what we used to do. Now the focus is more on why is my pen like a sword based on the context of that complex passage that we're looking at. So from there, we're going to go ahead and take a look at our next shift, and this is the evidence piece. In the evidence piece, we're talking about the fact that kids actually have to focus
and careful reading and analysis on that. They actually have to use the evidence we're collecting. One of the shifts we've had in my district over the last couple of years, we were doing a great job of having kids collect evidence. Now we're really focusing, okay, you have them collect it, but what are we going to use that evidence that they're collecting for? And then from there, we're going to go ahead and write to sources. We're just not going to go ahead and do these things outside on the end. This is the same idea that we're asking at the formative level, because if I want to prepare kids for that summative or that state test or whatever it might be, I need to check on things in a very similar manner. Then, of course, in terms of shift 3, we're really focusing a little bit more on those informational texts. As students move through the grades, we've got that greater focus to go ahead and support them, which we know is what's going to help them be college and career readiness. So on my next slide in front of you, you'll see kind of the steps that I take when I work with teachers and even myself when I go ahead and build a better ELA assessment. These are steps you can use for a big, giant summative, or it might be something that you want to use just for an informal check as you're going through. So it might be just a 2-question type thing that's going on. You could load this into a back channel chat. You could load this into some of the other things that people have mentioned. So really kind of the first step is to identify that theme of the unit and that essential question. What is it that we're really looking at in this unit? And this is not necessarily the theme of the book. It's the theme of what's going on in your total unit. Maybe we're studying all things about justice, and that's our question that we're looking at. From there, we go ahead and choose at least 2 passages that follow the guidelines for text complexity. You might say, why 2? Well, in our particular standard setup, we've got those standards that say, we need to go ahead and check on multiple texts because that's how students become career and college bound. With that, we want to make sure that those texts are cold reads, and this was a huge shift for us because if it's not necessarily a cold read, the question becomes, are you checking on memorization or are you checking on the ability to apply the skills that we taught to those passages? Remember, our standards are about transfer. They're not necessarily about a particular story, a particular novel, or a particular text. Then from there, we have to go ahead and organize those texts. Which text will give students the requisite background knowledge? That's the one that I found that goes ahead and supports the understanding in the other one, and we can go ahead and put this on. With that, somebody just asked a great question. Is this process the same even if you're not using digital tools? That's exactly right. It is the same process. No matter what's going on, we're going ahead and just building a more effective assessment in that regard. Then from there, if we're ready to check on writing, we would go ahead and write one overarching writing question that connects both passages to the text read within the unit. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and start to write questions that get at the depth of the standard, and we want to vary the depth as we go forward. Go ahead and then write a couple questions to support kids in their understanding of both passages. We want to bring that together. And then when it's all said and done, we're going to review the questions using the 3 instructional shifts to make sure we've done what we set out to do, which is our claims. Do the questions have academic vocabulary? Do they require students to use that evidence rather than just collect the evidence? And do all questions lead students to make sense of the text and areas where they tend to have difficulty so that they're building knowledge as they go forward? So from there, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Arthur, and he's going to help talk to us about evaluating formative assessment.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So when we're thinking about evaluating formative assessment, we want to look at 3 basic buckets, the way I like to think of them. And so what you see in front of you are think of these as guiding questions to frame your understanding and use of formative assessments. So the first bucket is feedback. And you want to make sure that whatever type of assessment that you're using formatively is giving you evidence of student learning in relation to the learning goals. And so here it's crucial to think about or distinguish between things that students may already know or funds of knowledge that they already may have. That's not the issue here. It's about, given the learning targets that we set, when I assess what they know, is it related to that goal? And then, is there evidence that allows me to change my instruction, to take some pedagogical action? That's the kind of feedback that we're looking for here. It's not necessarily about yes or no. It's not about a grade, but it's about, did they get it? And if they didn't get it, like, where can I interact? Where can I intervene to help students get it? The second bucket is about timing. Sometimes assessment happens so far removed from the instructional content, the instructional skills being taught, that there become other factors that affect how well students would do. So good formative assessment is timed so that in the moment you get that feedback. Is it embedded in the instructional activity, or is it a standalone thing? We want to move away from standalone assessment. We want to be assessing that feedback in the moment. And then the third thing is student involvement. Are the students getting the feedback? And I think so much about, like, essays, for example, right? Like, students write the essay, it takes so long. You guys know you have papers and all kinds of papers, and you've written all kinds of things, and it may take a long time for students to get that feedback. Formative assessment is designed for you to really be able to give students feedback closer to that instructional event, because that's what's going to be most helpful, right? When you see them making that mistake, or when you see that miscommunication or that misunderstanding, if you're right there with the involvement, can they change it in that moment? Can you say, hey, try it this way? Or, hey, I noticed that you struggled here. I want to give you a strategy. That's going to be most helpful for students. Another thing that we want to look at is the connection to student thinking. Formative assessment really is about, and Brian said this earlier, right? We can't cut open the heads of students and say, oh, they got that or they didn't get that. So formative assessment, a good formative assessment is going to ask students to explain what it is that they know or that they got or what they didn't get right in the moment. And that's the kind of information that's going to allow you to change your lesson plan, whether that's right there in the classroom or whether that's, I got all these exit tickets, and based on what we did yesterday, I realized I need to go over this again because some of us didn't get that. So being able to see and hear student thinking, that's the kind of data that we need. And so formative assessment, again, is going to happen right then. It's not going to be at the end of the unit where it's going to be hard to kind of tell where student thinking fell apart. So when we think about assessment, there's a lot of data that we get, and teachers have tons of concerns about the types of data that we get and then how we use that data. And so thinking about the different types of assessment, summative, interim, and formative, right, we get a lot of different concerns. I know that summative assessment, I'm from New York, and so we have, for example, Regents exams at the end of the year. And so if a student passes or fails a Regents at the end of the year's already over, right? So the teacher can't really act on that information. The data doesn't come back fast enough. It's already done. When we think about interim assessments, a lot of time those interim assessments are tied to specific standards, perhaps, right? And so the data is not specific enough, or it's too specific just at the standard level, but there may be other factors that have corrupted a student's understanding. And in the formative process, we don't really get data at this level, right? This is the data that happens for us in our classrooms all the time. So thinking about what your common responses to these concerns would be, we just want to say, summative data supports comprehensive reflection on teaching to adjust in the future, but again, we know that sometimes that data comes too late, right? And so that's something that we have to work against. That's just a concern of the system. And then interim data is the same way, right? Sometimes you get data about kids didn't do well on a specific question that had to do with a standard, and our response usually is to go back and teach that standard. Oh, my kids didn't understand simile, so I have to now do another 5 lessons on simile, but that might not really be what the issue was. The best data to affect our teaching and learning is that formative data, because in the moment, that's the data that's going to tell you where the students are not getting it and how you need to adjust your instruction, or where they're getting it, and then you can push their learning even further. Some of the other concerns about assessment, equity is a big one. And as an African-American male educator, I think about this all the time. Sometimes assessments are subject to bias. And that can be cultural bias just based on other factors. You may be testing, questions may be designed that are asking students something that is not really aligned specifically with the content or the skills that were being taught. Oh, I'm sorry, what happened there? I'm sorry.
Yes. Claire, the slides are moving.
Yes.
There we go. We're back to where we were.
Okay. So one of the reasons that we're having this conversation is that we just want to uplift for everyone, right, that assessments should be equitable, and I think formative assessment certainly is one of the ways in which to value the voices and the stages of learning and the funds of knowledge of all the students in your classroom. Another concern about assessment is instructional time. Tests take time that you could be doing other things with students. And so formative assessment, just reiterating the point that you want to build those assessments into the daily instructional activities rather than separate them as something to take a chunk of time away from instructional time. So formative assessment addresses these concerns by ensuring that each assessment is used for a specific instructional purpose, right? And the purpose is really to push student learning, to push student thinking around the skills and the content that you're trying to teach.
And Arthur, this is Laura. I'm just going to add on here. We don't want to come across as not thinking that summative assessment is valuable. It certainly is.
It is.
What we're
Absolutely.
saying is you can't, we hear lots of people say we're teaching to the test, we're teaching to the test. What we're saying is don't do that. Teach to the standards and do that through formative assessment, and when the year comes at the end, your kids are going to be fine and you won't feel like you've taught to the test. So it has valuable feedback for you as a teacher, because if at the end of the year none of your kids understood main idea and your scores come back from your summative and show that, then personally I would self-reflect and say, gosh, maybe I need to take a different strategy on main idea. Maybe I need to make it clearer that main idea relates to character development. But it's a great summative tool. It's just not what we want you spending the majority of your time on.
Great, thank you. And so again, to sum up, right, the purpose of formative assessment is to inform your instruction. And so what we have here, again, are just like kind of 3 different buckets. The analysis of student work in the moment can tell you whether students got it or didn't get it. And so when you're looking at student work in terms of their homework, the class notes that they're taking, the thought catchers, right, as you're standing over their shoulder and looking at what's being written down, are they getting the important points or not? Is that clear or is that not clear? Because then you can, right in that moment, say, hey, guys, I need us to all to get this main idea down, right? Or I see a lot of things here, but I want to uplift, Johnny did this. And that seems to be a really great exemplar of what we're looking for. You can look at strengths and weaknesses really quickly in those. When you're looking at student work, you can get a sense of students' different learning styles, and certainly to see who needs additional assistance or remediation. Similarly, in student discussion, as you move around your classroom, you're listening for the types of discussions that are giving you evidence that students are grappling with the problems, the instructional meat that they should be tackling, or they're not doing that. Or who's speaking a lot about that, so maybe they're getting it, and then who's silent. So you can get a lot of information there, and then based on that discussion, you can again jump in and remediate, or you can think about things like grouping. Like, okay, so I understood that this group got it and this group got it, but this group didn't, so tomorrow I might want to pull this group aside. And then finally, admit tickets, having students write things as soon as they come in or as they exit, having them write their summaries, again, is just ways to make their thinking more clear for you, and then that gives you a place to launch your next instructional activity. And this, again, like we said, is ELA, but I'm thinking about math all the time. Like, when students can explain their thinking about how they got the answer, that's, to me, so much more valuable than students who just get a right answer, because how did you come to that answer? Like, it's the process of understanding the math that's way more important than the ability to be able to get the question right in terms of instructional integrity. So using those those exit slips and those summaries to have students write and explain their thinking, it doesn't have to be long. And of course, you have to provide time for that to happen, but that really gives you a clear indication of where your students are. And so we've been talking about assessment, and a lot of it has been about like checks for comprehension and checks for understanding. We also want to mention, especially from the ELA standpoint, that we don't want to forget to monitor fluency in terms of students' ability to read, to decode with automaticity, and then also their comprehension. So there is some research here to support that fluency is important to students' comprehension, and we've given you some sources there that you can look up, including the work of Tim Rosinski. And then we also, in terms of fluency, what you're looking for are grade level texts and texts that you're using in your classroom to see whether or not students can read those texts. Because if they can't, then that also gives you valuable information that you can use to then modify or to differentiate or to provide scaffolding for students who need it. So, what do we do with this information that we've gotten from the formative assessments? What do? Student Achievement Partners has a resource. There's a guide it's called A Guide to Placing Text at the Center of Instruction, and you can use this resource to help answer that question. It talks about interim assessments, but it's still applicable, I would say, to formative assessments in terms of what's important and what we're looking for. And not every piece of this guide is specific to formative assessment, but we think in terms of a resource, in terms of your classroom instruction, it was well worth it for us to highlight it here for you to be able to use that. And you see the link there. You can either click on the link or you can go to the bit.ly. And so, questions. I think that's the end.
Yes.
We made it. Oh, my God, we made it, you guys.
Time for just a few questions. Brian, Arthur, thank you so much for this incredible amount of information. Super helpful. We've had a couple of questions coming in as the presentation has been going on. So I'm going to kick off with asking just a couple of those, and then maybe we have time for one or two more if people want to use that purple Q&A widget to ask a question of either Brian or Arthur or both. So the first question that we had come in, I think this was on a slide you shared earlier, Arthur, but either of you can answer. And that's just to clarify and share an example of a procedural checklist.
Sure. So I do not have an example to show everyone right there, but so, for example, if the task is asking students to write an essay, I might say, to be successful at this task, be sure to, and then I might have a series of bullets. Be sure to include a thesis statement that answers the prompt. Be sure to include evidence from 2 texts. Be sure to, and so just giving students the checklist to say, okay, I want to do this task. Do I have an answer to the question? Did I use the text? Did I format it correctly? Did I not only introduce my evidence with quotes, did I explain? And that's just like an ELA example, but just giving them a procedure. Or in terms of student discussion, when you're asking students to work in groups, you might give them a kind of protocol to read the person 1 reads the question aloud, right? Talk for 2 minutes about the question to make sure that we understand the question. Think for a minute to yourself and write something down on your handout. So just giving students those procedures that if they follow are going to help elicit the kind of instructional activity that's going to help them along the task. And then you can also, in terms of formative assessing, you can then see where the students are breaking down. I hope that answers.
Great. Yeah, that was wonderful, Arthur. Perfect. Thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, which came in earlier. And I'm going to share a slide from earlier in the webinar. This was a slide of yours, Brian. And we had someone ask about step 7 of this, and they wanted to know about the difference between collecting evidence and using evidence.
Sure, I'd be happy to take a stab at that. So the best way to conceptualize this is to actually think about what might go on a typical assessment. So I'm just going to make up a writing prompt here in my head, and I'm thinking of one I was working with teachers today on, and so it's an Achieve the Core mini assessment. And one of the questions asks kids to figure out what are the dangers for children and what are the dangers for adults based on a couple of passages they've read where characters are facing dangers, and that's really tied to the central idea. And sometimes what we'll have happen is we will have kids collect evidence that has absolutely nothing to do with that when it's all said and done. We might have kids, because we spend a whole unit on theme, go ahead and chart all of the different themes that are going on. So they've collected all that evidence about theme, but then we go ahead and we check on their learning. We say, tell us about the central idea. So it's kind of an alignment issue in some cases. In other cases, it could just be us having kids physically collect all of the different things that they know, but they're not actually applying it, perhaps in a writing prompt. Sometimes we might think of that as, citing my evidence, that I go into my paragraph and I go ahead and cite where I'm getting that from the text, rather than just collecting the evidence. Hope that clarifies that a little bit.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. So that is all that we have time for right now. I see there are a couple more questions in the Q&A widget, and we will have a record of those. So if there are some that we can answer via email, we'll definitely shoot you some email responses. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Arthur and Brian, for this wonderful, really informative webinar tonight. And I just want to remind everyone that we have webinars every first Wednesday of the month. So if you want to start planning ahead for October, our next webinar will be on mathematical language routines, vibrant discussions in the math classroom. And the link to register is both in the slide deck and in the resources widget. So we hope you'll be able to join us for that as well. Good night, everybody.